First of all, the Greek word telos means goal, or purpose, or end, the goal toward which something is directed. I cannot underestimate the importance of the fact that every model of education, whether it's secular or religious, progressive or classical, whatever, every model of education has, whether it admits it or not, whether it's implicit or explicit, a telos. That is to say, every model of education has a goal, a vision of the good life that it is attempting to pass on to its students.
Alrighty, Dr. David Diener grew up in northern Michigan and northeast Ohio, where he spent his childhood working in the family gardens, cutting wood, playing in cornfields, Bible quizzing, downhill skiing, playing music, and of course assiduously studying for school. As we shall see, he graduated Summa Cum Laude as an undergraduate for philosophy and ancient languages from Wheaton College. He then moved with his wife to Bogotá, Colombia, where they served as missionaries for 3 years at a Christian international school. He then earned an MA in philosophy, an MS in history and philosophy of education, and a dual PhD in philosophy and philosophy of education from Indiana University. Following 15 years in K through 12 private education, he now works at Hillsdale College, where he is an assistant professor of education. Dr. Diener, I am happy to have you and privileged to have you on Faith in Focus. Now, I have to ask, is it doctor? I know with this whole the Jill Biden thing, the doctor, when is it appropriate to use doctor? When is it not appropriate to use doctor?
Yeah. I mean, well, it's great to be here, Dennis. Thank you. So yes, either way is fine. I do have a PhD, so it's appropriate, but not necessary.
You're not going to be Surgeon General anytime soon, though.
No, that's absolutely correct. Not that kind of doctor.
Not that kind of doctor. Alrighty. I think I heard the rule is that if someone's having a heart attack and you would call on a doctor, then yes, they're a medical doctor. But
yeah, so it's a quick funny story actually. When I became a headmaster at a classical Christian school in Texas, we were the first year we were there. Our third child, we have 4 children, was pretty young at the time, and we were at this event, and she was having a conversation with my new board chair, right? And she said to him, sort of very confidentially, she said, everyone keeps calling my dad Dr. Diener, but he's not really a doctor, right? Like there's this big secret. So
yeah,
he got a big kick out of that.
Yeah, that's hilarious. Yeah, I think everyone is just now like wondering like, okay, when is doctor appropriate? When is doctor not appropriate? But yeah, I'm glad you got a sense of humor about it. So okay, I have a couple questions. Missionary in Bogotá, Colombia. I would love to hear a little bit about that. I got my undergrad from a mission school, if you're familiar with New Tribes Bible Institute. So a lot of people that I know, a lot of my friends are in missions, are very closely linked to missions. So to me, that's very interesting. I would love to hear about that, but I'll hand it over to you to kind of expound on that introduction I gave, as much or as little as you would like to share about who you are, where you came from, and how you got to where you are today.
No, that's great. Yeah, happy to answer any questions you have. So my parents were both teachers when I was growing up, and I had not really thought about becoming a teacher or professor. Thought for many years I was going to be a pastor. And then when I met my wife at Wheaton College, we got married. We knew we wanted to do some midterm mission work, so we didn't necessarily feel called to live overseas the rest of our lives, but wanted to do something more than 6 months or a year or something like that. And so we had contacts with a school in Bogotá. It's a Christian international school, El Camino Academy, and knew the director there. And so after college, we worked for a little while. I was doing carpentry work for an Amish company in Ohio, high-end trim work and building cabinets. And my wife was working, and then we decided to go there. We had connections there, and also my parents had both lived in Honduras before I was born. So I grew up hearing Spanish, and am fluent in Spanish. I speak to our 4 children in Spanish only, actually. So
even to this day.
Yeah, still to this day.
Oh wow!
So when our eldest was born in Bogotá while we were there, and we decided, hey, why don't I speak to him in Spanish and my wife in English, and we've continued that for, a couple decades almost now.
Well, yeah, I have heard that if you want children to be bilingual, that's the best way to do it, is just when you start them very young. And I've heard too, and we can get back to your story, but I wanted to ask this quick question. I have heard that teaching children from a young age to be bilingual or trilingual or multilingual, however many languages, is helpful, not just because it opens up opportunities, but it also causes children to think in a different way.
That's right.
That if you only speak one language, sometimes we get bogged down with the word and we think less about the meaning. Whereas if somebody is bilingual, they think in terms of like a definition and what things actually mean rather than like the literal language. I mean, does that seem to be true? It kind of
that's right,
causes
because
kids to think differently.
that's right, because words are signs that point toward concepts or toward realities, toward things, but they don't perfectly reflect or represent them. And so, yeah, when you study different languages or know different languages, have been in different contexts like that, you realize that there are certain ideas or concepts that aren't perfectly capturable by a certain word.
Yeah, I think I think we notice that sometimes if you speak with people who are bilingual and very, very fluently bilingual, sometimes they still pause like they're trying to find the right word. And sometimes that comes across as, I don't want to say ignorance, because anyone who's bilingual is usually more intelligent than the average person who only knows one language, but it kind of comes across like, man, how do you not know how to speak? But really probably what their mind is doing, at least some of the times, is they're thinking not a literal translation of each word that they're saying, but they're thinking in terms of concepts. And
yeah, you're trying to express something. You're trying to express an idea or a feeling or a thought or something that isn't quite encapsulated by the word that you have in that language. So yeah, that's right. So we were there and in Bogotá and loved it. I found that in terms of just going back to kind of my story, that I loved teaching. I fell in love with the classroom, with working with the students, with the academic engagement and the kind of platform that the classroom is for discipleship and for mentoring young people. And I had absolutely no credentials to teach at any level in the United States. So we said, well, unless we're going to live here the rest of our lives, we're going to have to go back for graduate school. And we would have stayed longer. We were very happy there. But then our eldest was born while we were there. And at that point, we had decided that I would go back to the U.S. to get a PhD. And so we said, well, if we're going to, now we have a kid, coming, and then we're going to start our family, have more children. And if we stay here for another 2 or 3 or whatever years, and then go through a PhD program, right? Then you've got kids who are in school age and transitions are more difficult. If we're going to go that route, let's just do it now. While we still only have one. So started graduate school with one, ended with 3, and we now have 4.
That's awesome. So you've been done you've been teaching, it looks like, for 12 years. Is that right? I was trying to look back into your bio. And so you've been done for over a decade, it sounds like. Have you found that it's difficult? And I'm asking just kind of like for my own curiosity's sake, teaching at the level that you're teaching at, obviously, is a pretty high level. Was that hard to find, even having the education? Is that hard to find a place? It always seems like I've looked a little bit online. I've got my graduate degree, but to teach, it seems like every place I look at, it's like you have to have X amount of years of teaching experience. I'm like, well, how do you get the teaching experience? And so, like, is that a challenge in that?
Sort of like developing a line of credit, right? You can't get credit until you have it, but you can't have it until you've been So,
right.
No, I think teaching is like every other profession or many activities. You start with some kind of skill or credential or something, and then over the years you develop it and hone that and look back on what you did at the beginning and think, oh wow, I wasn't very good back then, and you've grown, and so it works. So I was able to teach those years in South America, and then also and then taught college classes while I was in graduate school, and then part of the journey became very involved in the classical Christian school movement. And so at that point we had young children, and I was doing speaking and writing and work in the classical Christian education space. And so ended up then going a different direction and deciding not to become a professor at that time of the college at the college level, and instead work full time in K-12 classical Christian education. So I for 11 years was an executive administrator, administrative roles, headmaster of 2 schools in classical Christian schools.
Okay. And that school in Colombia, you said it was an international school, but was it specifically, was it for like, you'll have like international like dignitaries coming or something, or was it missionaries that would send their kids to a school, or was it a combination of all that stuff?
Great question. So it had been started in 1980 by Wycliffe missionaries, and but it had grown over the years. And so when we were there in the early 2000s, it was not exclusively for missionaries, but very much was a school that was missionally focused on serving those who were serving the church. So most of the students were either children of missionaries working in, for all different kinds of organizations, or children of Colombian pastors or people working in the church. We had a little bit of other, expat from the expat communities, like embassy families, but not very much.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, well, so you've mentioned this classical education, and as I've told you in talking before we started recording, I think a lot of people hear classical education and they don't necessarily know what that means. And if I was to assume what I think most people think it means, and maybe this is because we're usually monolingual and we can't think, we're just thinking, well, what does classical mean? Well, classical means old, like classical music, just old stuff, as opposed to maybe modern education. So could you maybe expound a little bit on what classical education actually is, what it entails, what it looks like, how it's maybe different than what people might think of as traditional education?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And it can be very confusing because we use classical in lots of different ways, right? And even in the example you just gave with music, we talk about classical music. But of course, if you're really a musician, you know that somebody like, let's say, Bach, who people would say, oh yeah, that's classical. You say, no, it's not, right? There's the Baroque period, there's the classical period, there's the Romantic period. Well, Beethoven, well, no, that, so, or Brahms or something. So even what we mean by classical music is ambiguous, right? And then to compound that, you say, what does the classical period mean? Or neoclassical art? Or, I mean, it gets very confusing. What are we talking about? So are we talking about Greeks and Romans, or, what? So let me offer the way that I think of this in a kind of basic way, and then maybe we can just unpack it.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So throughout the history of education, and I'll just say from the time of the ancient Greeks to the end of the 19th century, okay, so post-Civil War, let's say, there's a long history of educational practice and philosophy, and certainly not everyone agreed about everything, right? There's lots of discussions and debates. But there was more or less a cohesive understanding, or a more or less common understanding of what the purpose of education is and what education is for, right? And that changed radically, especially throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. And so for many centuries, what today we would refer to as classical education just simply was education, right? Yeah. So again, there's a much more nuanced story, but in short, if you take the educational paradigm or practices of, say, the ancient Greeks and Romans, in the early centuries, Christians were figuring out how to combine Christian catechesis and education, right, religious instruction, with this classical, in that sense, education tradition, right, which then throughout the Middle Ages continued, right, and on we go. So when I use the term classical education, okay, very broadly speaking, what I would say is it's an approach to education, or a belief about education, that the purpose of education is primarily, or most fundamentally, about cultivating human beings who are characterized by virtue and wisdom. and who have knowledge of themselves, who they are, the world, so that they can live well, right?
Gotcha.
That is something, say, the centrality of virtue, for example, is something that is pretty standard over the centuries. Now, just as a point of contrast, if I may, the contrast would be what came out in the 19th and 20th centuries to where we are today, where many people view, and it's not that that was a new idea then, but it sort of came to the fore, where many people today view education in instrumental terms. In other words, it's a means to an end, right? So you send your kid to a school, you want them to get a good education so that they can graduate and maybe go to a good college, or you want them to go to a good college so they can graduate and get a good job, so that they can make a good salary and have a comfortable life, or something like that. There are lots of people in our society today that would, whether they recognize it explicitly or not, that's the way they think about why education is valuable, right? Or even the way that oftentimes politicians or government leaders talk about education, right? We need to increase the workforce. We need to increase economic opportunity, right? It's a means to an end. And what gets lost in that is, what kind of a human being are you forming? So I'll just give you two quick examples. The whole way back to the Greek philosopher Plato, Plato says that how he defines education is the training from childhood in virtue, right? So becoming fully human, knowing what kind of a thing you are and how you should live, that's education. And he says that's involved with developing your love so that you hate what you ought to hate and love what you ought to love. That's education, okay? If we go, say, from there, 4th century BC in Athens, the whole way to the late 20th century, the Christian philosopher Arthur Holm wrote in his book, The Idea of a Christian College, he said, the question to ask of education is not, what can I do with it, but what is it doing to me as a person, right? And then he goes on to say, Christian education is about the making of persons, Christian education about the making of Christian persons. So there's a lot more to say in terms of if you want to maybe talk about the landscape of classical education today, but most basically that's what I would say. It's not just old dead stuff.
Sure. So and so that was really good. And you, even in saying that, my mind is already connecting the dots to, you said in the classroom as an excellent opportunity for discipleship, because what is discipleship? We're seeing the life of Christ formed into a person. Now, of course, that can broadly be, I mean, if it's not a Christian classical education, it would be just maybe you might want to say good citizen or something like that, a virtuous citizen. But it is maturing the person, and you've even used the word wisdom, and you've living well, this idea of wisdom. What is the classic example that people say? Knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing that it doesn't belong in a fruit salad. So wisdom is applied knowledge, and that's what a crucial distinction it sounds like you're making too. In classical education, yes, information is involved, but the goal is not just a person who knows lots of stuff, but a person who's living well, who's applying what he or she has learned. And of course, that overlaps heavily with discipleship and why the classroom is a perfect opportunity for discipleship.
Absolutely. I mean, to your point, there are lots of really smart, evil people in the world, and we don't need more of them. So that's exactly right. Getting high test scores is a fine thing, but it's not the ultimate purpose of education.
Yeah. You mentioned kind of a time frame where it seemed like things shifted from a classical to what we might think of as a modern, and you kind of pinned it. You said after the Civil War, the later part of the 19th, early 20th century. I have heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it would fall within that timeline, that a lot of our educational model today kind of served, like you said, it served a purpose of, that's right about the time the Industrial Revolution, factories, and so now everything is geared towards that. Put a kid in a class for 8 hours, or a school, it not only trains them for an 8-hour workday to know that the time frame is even the same. You get up, you go to school at 8, you get out at whatever time. But it's just teaching you facts, and it's cranking you out almost like you're a product to then go back into that system. Is there core parallels in history? Is that why that shift has happened, or is there more to it than that?
So no, it's a great insight. So what was happening with the Industrial Revolution, that does play a huge role in the changes that were happening in education in the 19th century, because what came to the fore is the idea that we need education to prepare skilled workers, right? So you have all these jobs that didn't exist before. You have new branches of knowledge that are being explored. And so this idea that we need education. I mean, why would you study, Latin? I mean, if you're going to go work in a factory, that's not that helpful. So, and note that even implicit in that way of thinking is education should be useful, right? So this
Right.
idea that we value education because it will prepare us to do something, or to have a certain kind of job
Right.
that means to that end. So that's exactly right. And if you think about our system of contemporary education today, it is in many ways built on a kind of industrial metaphor. I mean, think of the assembly line. So you're right, you mentioned. I mean, if you've ever been to a factory that makes cars or whatever, and you
I've
see,
worked in one. It's the
yeah,
worst.
yeah. Well, how things go down a assembly line, right? And at each you get to a station and it stays there for some amount of time, a minute or whatever, right? And then the belt moves and it goes to the next station and it's there and then it moves. I mean, think about what students in most schools today do in the period of a 7 or 8 period day, right? They go from one station with one specialist who's trained to do this thing, say, pre-algebra, and then they go to the next station. It's in a different place with a different specialist who's trained to do, teach American literature, whatever the thing is, right? And also just think about even on a year-to-year basis the way this works. So think back to Little House on the Prairie days. Laura Ingalls Wilder was in a one-room schoolhouse with all the students together, and you're studying at whatever level you are, and it's this kind of continuous process. And now we have, again, kind of like a conveyor belt. You go through first grade, and then if you're done with that station, you get moved the next year to this next discrete, station. And if something's a problem, well, then you have to go back a station to get it redone. I mean, so it's a very industrial kind of approach to education with the children as the products, as opposed to seeing it as a process of human being soul formation in which we are passing on the knowledge, the wisdom, as we guide and shape their loves, their affections, their souls to be able to then live well.
Yeah. It doesn't seem intuitive that because a kid is at a second grade math level, but he's chronologically should be in fourth grade, that should somehow be held against him or her. Like what is that reflective of, other than maybe they just don't think in terms of math? That has nothing to do, I mean, unless what your goal is to have a person who comes out of 12 years of education who knows this, it's like information is what we want to inculcate rather than, like you said, virtue. So but it doesn't seem reasonable that we would hold kids to that standard.
We all develop at different rates and different in different areas of strength. That's right.
Yeah. One of the things, as I was looking at classical education online and kind of prep for this, it talked a little bit about, and maybe you can delve into this, or maybe this is completely wrong, but it kind of talked about these different stages. We've used this language of like moving through different stages, but rather than thinking of it in like in first and second and third grade and those kinds of things, it talks about, is it the trivium? Is that how it's pronounced?
Sure.
This idea that, when kids are younger, they learn certain ways and in certain things. It even mentions how, kids at a certain age learn through singing and rhyming and we kind of intuitively know that this is true. That's why we sing the ABCs. We sing songs with young kids. Can you kind of walk through that? Like, is this, it seems like there's still a system in place when you're doing classical education, but maybe it's not quite as assembly line-esque as the traditional schools.
Yeah. So if you've never visited a classical school, first of all, I would encourage you, or anyone of the listeners, to do so if you can, because it's really quite remarkable. Those who are doing it well, the amount and the caliber of learning that's happening, and the sense of decorum and respect and reverence and the kinds of discussions the students are having. It's really a wonderful thing. So to answer your question or where you're going there with the trivium, that kind of interpretation of what classical education is, or of classical pedagogy, comes out of an essay that Dorothy Sayers, who was a friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, in Oxford in the 1940s. She gave this talk called "The Lost Tools of Learning," and in that talk, what she does is she maps the three traditional liberal arts of the trivium. So traditionally, there are 7 liberal arts. There were different people who came up with different lists, Capella and Vitruvius and different people, but this list of kind of 7 emerged as fairly standard. And the verbal arts are grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And then the mathematical arts are arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Okay, so these are sort of the traditional 7 liberal arts. And you see them depicted in paintings and sculptures and stuff. Okay, so what Dorothy Sayers did was she took the 3 disciplines of the trivium, the grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and mapped it onto what she observed about different stages of childhood development. Right, and there's some value there in terms of like young children are very able to absorb facts, so they typically do a lot of memorizing history timelines or scripture, poems, things like that. I've memorized scripture my whole life, and it's a lot harder now than it was, 20 or 30 years ago. It just doesn't stick as much. So that, and then at some point in terms of cognitive development, students are able to start thinking critically in a way they weren't before, and using arguments and reason. And that'd be sort of in Sayers' interpretation, the logic, stage, and then you get to rhetoric, which is where you present your ideas beautifully and persuasively. Now, many classical schools today reflect that, frankly, that essay. I mean, that talk she gave in the 40s in some way. But I would say the tradition of classical education and what it means, it should not be reduced to that. In other words, it's a much bigger, longer, deeper tradition than just reducing it to, that's what classical education is.
If you've been a listener of Faith and Focus for a while, I would encourage you to become a supporter of the ministry by becoming a monthly donor. Your generous donations allow me to continue working within Faith and recording new content. You can find a link to my donation page in the show notes for this episode. Thank you.
Yeah, if it gets ossified that way, it just becomes another system, like in a process, and it becomes.
That's right.
This is now the information you have to learn, rather than maybe some other set of facts or data or whatever.
Right, but that paper that she gave was really important historically, because if we want to fast forward, then, like, what's going on in classical education today, that idea that Dorothy Sayers wrote about and spoke about was then started to be put into place. It was sort of found, and some people in the early 80s said, well, what would happen if we actually built a school this way? And so there were a few different schools that started right around the 81 out in Idaho and Indiana and Kansas. There were a couple, and with different sort of sources of influence and things. But that really, it was in some ways based on, especially in Idaho, the Sayers essay. And that then gave rise during the 80s and in through the 90s to an absolute explosion in what I would call the classical education renewal movement. Okay. So parents who started saying, hey, we're not satisfied with the educational options that we have. Like, there's got to be something more. And started reading and learning about the tradition of classical education, and said, wow, this is incredible. We want to do this. And so little classical Christian schools popping up, people starting to do classical homeschooling as well. And then in the early part of this century, so more recently, some classical public charter schools also that have begun to emerge and are growing very, very rapidly. So yeah, the landscape of classical education over the past, say, 40 years has absolutely exploded.
Yeah. Just as like a technical question, how would a classical school fit in with, I mean, presumably, your classical schools are still held accountable to fit within some kind of paradigm that our country fits in. Like standardized testing, is that still required? Like, is that like to run a classical school? Do you still have to put kids through standardized testing and say, hey, we're not just, teaching these kids to, read the Bible or something. We're actually teaching them things that our country thinks that they need to learn. How does that have to fit within that structure, or is the complete freedom to do whatever you want? I mean, how exactly do you keep one foot in both of those worlds?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is that it depends on what kind of classical school and on what state.
Okay.
So if we start with, let's say, the charter classical schools, okay, the classical charter schools, those are publicly funded schools. They have freedom to do different curricular things and some things that a typical local public school district school doesn't. But they are subject to state laws in terms of testing requirements and things like that. Okay.
And that's kind of contingent on the funding, right? Because they're still publicly funded.
Yeah, and the funding structures are different. It depends. There's a lot of variation state by state. Okay. If you go into the private school side in terms of the classical Christian schools, those have a much higher degree of independence. And again, though, it's going to depend by state. Most classical Christian schools do some standardized testing, even if it's not required at all. But the emphasis is much less on that, right?
Sure.
And the way in which it's used and the relevance of the data. So I serve on the board for the Board of Academic Advisors for the CLT, which is the Classic Learning Test. So actually, there's this company CLT out of Annapolis, Maryland, that for a number of years now has been offering schools standardized test options. It's that are better than the SAT or ACT, right?
Sure.
So as opposed to answering questions about a text from a vacuum manual, which is actually, that's a true example. The passages that students are being asked to read and analyze are coming from great literature and great thinkers, of the tradition. So CLT is a really interesting thing, but that's one way in which the classical school world has responded to this question about testing.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other thing is, it seems like classical education. I mean, every time you type it in on Google and pull up a website, it's got pictures of old statues from Greek and Rome. It's almost like they're inseparable. I mean, you have to have it. And it seems like our culture is, and this is why I kind of ask, like, classical versus modern education. I mean, there's that refrain now, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. How can you can't, it doesn't seem like you could have a classical education if you're saying Western Civ has got to go. I mean, isn't that kind of one of the foundational pillars to a classical education?
So the foundational pillar is, or let me say, what undergirds that looking back to the past is a respect and a veneration for the wisdom that has been handed down to us and the heritage that we have from those who have gone before us. Okay. So you don't read old dead books, or say old books written by dead people because they're old. There's nothing intrinsically good about something that's old or an author who's dead. Okay. But human beings have lived on this earth for at least thousands of years.
Right.
And they have asked many of the same questions and wrestled with the same issues and realities. And so, I mean, look, think of it this way. If I want to learn how to play chess, right, I'm not just going to sit down with a chessboard and say, I think I'll start moving these pieces around. This one I think should go there, right? What am I going to do? I'm going to have somebody teach me, and I'm going to learn strategies and openings and, from masters or from books that they've written, from people who know more about it than I do, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same is true in almost any field of knowledge. You learn and become excellent at something first by learning from those who have gone before you. I mean, one other example, the many of the best writers and authors, they didn't just say, I'm going to just become an author and sit down and write a, best-selling novel. They studied other writers or painters, you study those who have gone before. Okay, so the question would be, what about if you want to learn how to live well?
Right.
What if you want to live a virtuous and wise life? Wouldn't it be foolish to say, like moving chess pieces around on a chessboard, well, I'm just going to figure it out, and I'm just going to use my own ideas and make up, what I think I ought to do.
Yeah.
How foolish, right? And so when we read ideas or texts from the past, it's not that all of the people who have gone before us were right about everything. Of course they weren't. They were wrong.
Right.
We're all sinful human beings, and we make mistakes. But there is a tradition, and this is part of the education tradition of over centuries and centuries and centuries, wisdom being handed down and thought about and discussed and debated and implemented. And that's why we read, old books. Say Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics or Augustine, or Aquinas, or on down the road. I mean, you don't read these guys because they're old and dead and their books, are crumbling on your shelf. The reason why they're valuable is because they're asking questions and having insights that are universal to human beings across all times, across all cultures, across all socioeconomic, gender, whatever differences. These are human questions, right?
Sure.
And so if we want to learn how to be human beings well, we would be foolish not to learn from that tradition. The same is true, say in the Christian walk, you don't just make up what you think, right? We have a tradition that of many who have gone before us, who have struggled and walked and grown and fallen and learned and given glory to God through all they did. And it would be foolish not to learn from that.
Right. Yeah, the Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith, I mean, you're supposed to look back into the past and learn. Doesn't mean everything that those people did. I mean, you can read the Old Testament. There's a pretty strong record of them doing the wrong thing a lot of the times.
That's right.
But they did do some right things. So a good idea is a good idea no matter where it comes from, and no matter how far back in time it comes from. And so essentially it's sort of a, what are you privileging? All things created equal. Do we go with something that's been time tested and has been around for a long time, or do we go with this person who's got this new idea? Maybe they're right, maybe they're not, but if I'm putting my chips on the table, I'm going to probably want to go with the person or the idea or the way of thinking that's been around and has been tried and tested for quite a long time.
Yeah, and it's not even just about, whether something is, say, 10 years old or 100 years old or 1,000 years old. I mean, I think many people in our contemporary society don't even respect elders, our elders who are alive with us, our parents and our grandparents, right? We think that we've progressed, we're progressive, we don't have the prejudices they did, we don't have the silly thoughts and ideas they did. I mean, how arrogant, right? C.S. Lewis talks about this as chronological snobbery. To think that the time in which you live is superior to all those who have gone before. And so it's not just about, again, sort of, necessarily older is better, but it's about having a posture of humility to say, I'm asking questions, or I'm thinking about things, or I need to learn things. And there are lots of other people who have done this before me. And so I should humble myself and learn from them as a starting point. Another way this sometimes gets said is that imitation precedes creation, right? So again, if you think about a painter, you don't just sit down with a canvas and start painting masterful works. You have to study those who have gone before you and imitate them, and then over time you learn. And it's the same thing with with learning how to live well. So
yeah, and so I think that you hit on something. I mean, you talked about progressive, and we have that privilege. We have that inherent mental. We give this privilege to the new thing, and we talked about at the end of the 20th century, this idea of this progressive movement. You can kind of look at it and you think a lot of the horrible things that happened in the 20th century, we look back on and think those were really bad ideas. But at the time, it was the intellectuals who had those ideas. These things like eugenics, we look back on it and think that's horrifying, but the intelligentsia is who believed it at the time. And it was, at least it seems in part, that they were privileging this person who I know all the information, the cutting edge now, It's not a humility.
I'm
There's
the
not.
expert.
I'm
in
the
this
expert,
time. Yep.
and so we face it down to this day, right? This whole mantra now of trusting the experts. And correct me if I'm wrong, a modern education, as we've been talking about, would almost privilege the experts, because if you're just being fed information, it's whoever has the most information with the most data, they must be the one who's correct.
The latest, the most up to date. Yep.
Yes. Whereas a classical education might say, okay, hold on, I can take in the data, but I have learned how to think about the data. And so maybe there's some wisdom inherited in being able to discern good and evil. I mean, you might think, well, this sounds like a really good idea that we should pursue this policy or this course of action. I mean, all the data seems to support it, but then there's just something in your gut that you're like, something doesn't seem right about this. And maybe that's where classical education can help out.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And so what I think, what classical education recognizes is that there should be an alignment between the goals that we have for our children and then the practices that we put in place, right? And so that often is lost in educational systems. I mean, look, every system of education is directing students towards some kind of goal, right? Yeah. It's cultivating them into some kind of person. And the question is, what kind of person do you want your child to be cultivated into, right? If you want your child to be a good secular humanist, well, there are lots of schools that will do that, right? If you want your child to know a ton of information and have super high test scores and not have thought very much about virtue and wisdom, there are schools that will do that, right? If you want your child to memorize a lot of Bible verses and love Jesus, but not really have been taught to think very well or learn from the intellectual tradition that we've inherited, there are schools that will do that on down the line, right? So the question is, what is the vision that we should have for our children and want to pass on to them? And then what classical education asks very seriously is, okay, based on those goals and our assumptions about what kind of a thing the human being is and what learning is, how do we then embody that in the practices of an actual school or homeschool, right?
Yeah. And I think that is what, I mean, you said for the past 40 years there's been this resurgence of classical education. I think as I'm listening to it, what I think maybe it's unspoken or it's unknown what parents are wrestling with and struggling with is, especially now, I think in the past 10 years, as we've seen the public school system take a radical shift, and now they seem to be teaching how to be a good person in our world now, which includes things ideologically that most parents are like, well, wait a second, I don't agree with this at all. So it's almost like the modern school system has taken, at least in part, the truths of classical education. We want to teach your children virtue, morals, goodness, how to be a good person. But these are the morals that we're going to teach them. It's these new things that you as a parent maybe are like, hold on, wait a second. And so I think most parents are saying, just teach my kid math and science. That's almost like a traditional education. I don't want I don't want your neoclassical education, if we could coin a term, like this postmodern classical education maybe. But what parents, I think, mostly want is they want that classical education. We want our children to be good citizens, virtuous citizens and stuff. But what we're seeing coming out of the public school system seems to be the opposite of that.
That's right.
Inculcating them in a morality that most people, I think, are averse to.
Well, to go back to the point you made earlier, ideas have consequences, right? So philosophical ideas or ideas about what education should be, what we're seeing around us in the landscape of education today didn't just come out of a vacuum. It is the working out of some very specific ideologies. And, I mean, I'm thinking of C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man in the 1940s, who says, toward the end of that book, he says that the armchair philosopher, right, the casual intellectual who who has rejected absolute standards of morality, right? The absolute right and wrong, and has turned to a kind of subjectivism or moral relativism. He says that will bring about the destruction of civilization. And then later toward the end of the book, he says that mild-mannered, philosopher sitting there in his armchair is in the end just as bad as an evil dictator, right? And as if you think about that, what that meant when he said and wrote that in the mid 1940s, our country needs it, the church needs it, the world needs it.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's one of the things that I've been thinking about recently. I just as a side note, I don't know if you've played around with Chat GPT, that AI chat generator thing. Or
I'm familiar with it and have not used it myself.
Yeah, well, I fooled around on it, and it's kind of creepy. I ask it to tell me a parable that Jesus told that's not recorded in the Bible, and it spit out this fake parable that kind of sounds like something Jesus would say, and it's only going to get more and more sophisticated. And so I've just been thinking about in the people that I've been discipling and teaching, I've been trying to kind of to sound the warning that we're heading into. I mean, we think that we're living in an information crisis right now, and it's going to get even worse once we're wearing technology on our face that augments reality. We're being fed stories that are generated by AI. And what I fear, and this is kind of bringing it back to the classical education, is that the church and just society as a whole, if we're just information based, well, then we're stuck. What information do we follow? And this, of course, comes with the fake news and misinformation. The only thing our world has to offer is we will decide what is accurate and what is false, and we will silence what we think is false, and we'll give you what we think is true. Whereas somebody who's maybe trained in a classical education has the wisdom to discern good and evil, and this is not accurate. Right. Somebody who hears that parable, if they've got a classical understanding of what the scriptures teach, they can say that might sound like Jesus, but that's not anywhere in the Bible. That's fake news, if you want to.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, a lack of information is not what is causing most of the deep problems we face as a society. And so just getting more information is not the answer. And in a world that Neil Postman says is awash in information chaos, right? Yeah. Like there's so much information, it becomes chaos. What do you do with it? The importance of wisdom and of discernment is even greater. Yeah. So I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are coming up on an hour. Is there any hope we can offer to people, parents with kids that are stuck in this crumbling system? What hope can we offer?
Well. First of all, Jesus said to his disciples in John 16, "In this world you will have trouble, but
I've overcome the world."
Yeah, but have hope, right? So yes, there's always hope. For I've overcome the world. So yes, of course there's hope. Regardless of I'll say on a sort of macro theological plane, and then talk about education just a bit. But yes, of course there's hope, because we know how the story ends. And so regardless of what is happening around us, the victory has been won. And we know how eternity will work itself out, right? Ultimately, that doesn't mean that the challenges we face today as individuals or as a society are not important. They are, but yes, there's hope, right? We can take heart knowing that He has overcome the world. Specifically with regard to education, I would say there are an increasing number of options that parents have, and so I certainly don't think that classical education is necessarily the right answer for everyone, right? I mean, I don't want to be that universal about it, but I have dedicated my career and in many ways my life to promulgating and deepening this approach to education, because I think it is so incredibly valuable and so incredibly powerful. So if there are parents out there who are interested, I would just say do some looking around, go visit. There are, as I've said, there are classical charter schools, right, that are publicly funded, that are doing many great things in cultivating virtue and great citizens. There are private Christian classical schools that are doing many things and within a private Christian context of these things we've been talking about. There's an incredibly fast-growing, rapidly growing movement of homeschoolers that are homeschooling classically. So there are organizations like Classical Conversations, or some programs that offer online classes also, Scholae Academy through Classical Academic Press, or Memoria Press, or there are others that offer some resources, curriculum, classes for homeschoolers. So in all of those sort of arenas, there are options, and I would encourage people to look around and become educated on what's out there, and do what you think is best for your child. Make the best decision you can. Education is so important, though, and maybe I'll close with this thought. I was just reading with some of my graduate students today a Renaissance Italian humanist, right, Verherdio, and he was talking about parents. He opens this work by saying that parents should be concerned about three things if they want to raise good children. And the first one is what they name them. Names are important, he says. And the second is where they raise them, the kind of environment. And the third one is give them an education in the liberal arts. And so if you think about that, one of the most impactful decisions that a parent makes on the education or on the future of their child, both for this life and eternally, is the education that they receive. So I think we should take this seriously, and I'm blessed to be able to work in this field.
Dr. David Diener, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insight. I appreciate what you're doing, and I thank you for coming on Faith in Focus. And hopefully sometime down the line we can have another conversation and delve into this stuff a little bit more. And I appreciate what you're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. God bless.
All right. Thank you.
While Faith in Focus is a ministry of In Faith, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of In Faith as a mission.